Hello and thank you for watching. This recording is based on a PowerPoint presentation given by me, Keith Cooper, to Asby History Group in Great Asby Village Hall in Cumbria on May the 4th, 2022. It attempts to shine some light on the meaning of changing names of some fields and landscape features in the parish across many centuries. And, hopefully, it will also help us to understand what those names can tell us about the historic landscape. Discussion of this topic began a number of years ago with two friends who are regular visitors to Dial House in the village of Great Asby, Harry Hall and Dr. Peter Allender. Sadly, neither of them has lived to witness this rather modest product of those conversations, so this presentation is dedicated to their memory. A long time ago, the archaeologist Jacquetta Hawkes wrote that place names are among the things which link men, I did tell you it was a long time ago, which link people most intimately with their territory. People and their territory, people and place, are of course entangled at all sorts of levels, functionally, emotionally, intellectually, physically. We're all, continually, working and reworking one or more of these ways of interacting with the place where we live. All I want to do this evening is add, or perhaps enrich would be a better word, one strand of raw material for you to include in the warp and weft of your own entanglement with the landscape of the parish. The kind of place names I'm looking at, field names and those of natural features, are what scholars of the subject refer to as minor place names. I'm going to look in the main at field names, but will also glance at names of some landscape features. Once upon a time, there was widespread use of names for individual fields for every tiny natural feature, partly perhaps because of the kind of thing Jacquetta Hawkes was talking about, that giving names to places gives meaning to a landscape and creates a sense of place and of belonging. That's something which Stephen Milson and Stuart Brooks write about at considerable length in their recently published book Peasant Perceptions of Landscape, which examines detailed evidence in an area on the Oxfordshire-Berkshire border. But there was also widespread use of names because those names had a very practical purpose. When the agricultural landscape of Asby Parish was more heavily populated, and when manorial tenants would have had their holding of strip fields in many different locations, scattered across the communally farmed fields, these locations needed to have a name. Even within living memory, when farms were employers and were not being operated almost entirely by immediate family members very familiar with the farm landscape, Brian Park of Croft House in Great Asby points out you needed to be able to tell people where to work. We've lost touch with the meaning of many field names, and, to some extent, with the meaning of names of natural features, in a way similar to that in which we may be beginning to lose touch with everyday nature words. In their rather fine book, The Lost Words, some of you may have bought this book for your grandchildren or read it to them, Robert Macfarlane and Jackie Morris explain how words like acorn, bluebell, kingfisher and wren had been removed from the Oxford Junior Dictionary, a widely used children's dictionary, because those words were not being used by enough children to merit inclusion. Despite this kind of pessimism, minor place names are something which does attract interest here in the Northwest and elsewhere. For example, you can see that I've stolen the first part of this evening's title from one of the products of a Rustland Horizons project. The Rustland Valley lies in the southern part of the Lake District National Park, between the lakes of Coniston and Windermere. But the title was stolen, I hasten to add, with the permission of joint author Mandy Lane. The same project produced the quirkily named Featherbed and Shive of Cheese, The Duddon Valley History Group have produced the more straightforwardly named field names of the Duddon Valley. And you'll have spotted that I've borrowed the second part of my talk's title from who I regard as the leading living historian of Cumbria, Angus Winchester, who's produced 2 books on minor place names, a slim guide for local historians on field names, and a lengthier study, Language of Landscape. The second, rather lovely book is also part memoir, drawing upon Angus's childhood and adolescence in the Lawton, Loweswater and Buttermere Valley. It also offers more examples of what might be described as the found poetry that you sometimes come across in the name of fields and natural features. As with Mandy, I also sought Angus's permission to adapt and incorporate his title into my own title for this evening's talk. In return, I did promise to recommend his book, which I do wholeheartedly. For those who attended this talk on May the 4th, there was a copy to inspect before they rushed out to place their order. For those of you watching the recording, if you don't already own a copy, just head off to one of the region's independent booksellers to make that order or make that purchase. Navigating minor place names can be a bit tricky, and to be honest, it's an area of study which is regarded by some scholars with something approaching scorn. But with care, some interesting backstories can be found, for the names can be sources of intimate knowledge for the history of a landscape. Here are some of the things to be careful about. The first arrow about derivation of names from a particular language, and the foremost regional example of a language from which we derive a number of our local minor place names, is Old Norse. We still use many Old Norse words when we speak of landscape features, gill, fell, beck, and so on. In 2017, when Rory Stewart was presenting a television documentary, Borderlands I think it was, he referred to the souls of the Vikings being preserved in these fells. I'm not entirely sure about their souls, but their voices certainly are. But this preservation, this survival, lies at the core of the first warning. Just because a place name is derived from a particular language, perhaps a largely lost language, doesn't mean that it first came into being when there was still a lot of the population speaking that language. English and English dialects have absorbed many linguistic influences, and those linguistic influences continued to be expressed in place names at a much later date than might be expected. So be careful about making links between minor place names and dates when those first came into being. Looking at the second paragraph here, we're not this evening going to get tied up in the detail of the rules and processes through which minor place names change and morph across the centuries, but there are 1 or 2 things to bear in mind. Evolution of a language permits other things to happen. If a name no longer means anything in the evolved language, it may drift towards a new form. For example, Matlack, meaning moot oak or the meeting oak, became matlock. It retains the sound but loses the meaning. Or, as language changes and meanings of names become obscure, attributes which already form part of a name may be added to it. So, in Asby Parish, Linglow Hill already had part of its name, which means hill. That's the low, derived from how, and before that the Old Norse haka. The other element, ling, meant heather or heather covered. But when the meaning of low became obscure, hill was added to Linglow. So now we have the heather covered hill. Finally, minor place names can undergo changes because of changes in pronunciation or just because of errors of hearing or transcription. Some of these errors may have occurred at the time of the Ordnance Survey from the middle years of the 19th century onwards. Surveyors would not necessarily have been familiar with local dialects and may have misheard and incorrectly recorded some of the place names which local people gave to them. but this incorrect name became the official name, preserved for all time. Minor place names are made up of elements. Place names can consist of a single generic element, usually a noun, but many place names comprise more than one element, a generic and a specific. Simple examples of generic elements are words for enclosures of land like close, croft or field. Then there is a specific element. Common examples might be a personal name. For example, in Asby we find Ellis and Close and Rudd, Croft, and many, many more that incorporate a family name. The specific might also have to do with vegetation naturally found in a landscape feature or in a field. It might refer to the livestock kept in a field or the crop grown there. Or the specific may indicate an association of a place or field with some form of wildlife. Think of reading the language of the landscape as a bit like reading an old text which has had many different hands writing on it. Some of the words will be unchanged from the first time they were spoken and later written down. Others will have been partly crossed out and had some letters added. Yet other words will have been erased completely, with new words written in their place, perhaps more than once. So don't go out into the landscape without having a dictionary or glossary in your head to help you understand its language. There are probably more than 2,000 minor place names in Asby Parish, but we have time, of course, to look at only a very small sample. So I've created a number of categories. We'll look at a few of these in more detail and try to pick out some names which have more of a story attached to them. So this is, if you will, a curated walk, a very meandering curated walk across some parts of the parish landscape. What kind of sources have I used to put this story together? Well, there's the 1843 tithe map and schedule, which captures all the field names in use at that date. There are enclosure maps from the 19th century, and we have at least 4 of them. There are early Ordnance Survey maps, but an important footnote this, I haven't yet looked at the relevant Ordnance Survey name books, in which surveyors recorded place names given to them by a range of local people. The Asby name books are in the National Archives, and I haven't had time to arrange a visit. 18th century estate maps, we've only got 2 of these, one for Asby Grange in the Archives and another for Grange Hall in the possession of Andrew and Fiona Harrison. Charters and other documents dating from the 12th century to the 19th century. There are a great many of these. I'm not going to list them all, but these of course very often contain older forms of minor place names, many of which had changed or been lost by the time of the tithe map. And perhaps most important of all, local farmers and wallers who've helped me understand the nature of the land and its relationship to the names which people have given to it. Sadly, as you can see here, some of them have now passed on. But the top of the list, Kenny Bainbridge, very much still with us, of course, and he was recalling his years at the farm of Stenkeld. Down through to, at the end there, Philip Taylor at Waterhouses and Ronnie Walker, who was until recently at Elm Tree here in Great Asby Village. And a final, different acknowledgement. All of the aerial images I have used are taken from Google Earth, with the exception of a LiDAR image that is individually acknowledged on the slide. Many of us, or at least those of us of a certain age, will remember from our history classes at school being told about the 3-field, open field or common field system associated with medieval manors. But the common fields, or town fields as they were known in this region, sometimes numbered more than 3. Perhaps this was because in this region areas of good land suitable for cultivation of crops were smaller and more scattered. But remember that term town field because we'll encounter it again. A dyke or bank would have surrounded those town fields, acting as a barrier between the crops growing in the town fields and the open summer grazing on the outer moors and fells, keeping the horn from the corn, as the saying goes. Some lost parish field names may be echoes of sections of this kind of boundary, known variously as a head dyke, ring dyke, or outring fence. For example, as you can see on the screen here, we find fields in Asby called Crookie Dyke and Six Dykes. I can identify at least 4 of these town fields in the manor of Asby Windawath. The names are here, but only one so far in Asby Coatsford. In looking more closely at some names, I'm going to deal with only 2 town fields in Asby Windawath, the last on the list that you see here, Stannerstones and Trowlands. Here is Stannerstones, its area highlighted in a rather dingy yellow. Each of these fields, after later enclosure, retained the element Stannerstones in its name. Spend a moment or two getting your bearings. There's the village of Great Asby at the bottom right of the image. I've also marked the location of one building, Stannerstones Field House, just below the centre of the screen. Here is that field house, and some of you will recognise it from your walks on footpaths around Great Asby. It's a rather fine banker barn, probably constructed at some time between 1790 and 1804, and I'm grateful to Jen Callis of Winton for this image. Although this field house was probably built after the town field strips were mostly enclosed, what was once the area of the communally farmed town field lay to the right and left of the field house, away up towards the skyline. Here is the field area again. It was probably reached by extension of Croftley Lonning or Lane. You can see that at bottom centre. That name itself was probably derived from the fact that the lane provided back lane access to the Windawath croft fields that lay between it and the village away to the bottom right. We find a number of mentions of Stannerstones in the Asby Windawath Manor Court books, and this one in the first paragraph here, taken from a Manor Court book entry dated January the 22nd, 1735, is typical. Christopher Elliotson took one close of meadow called Stangerstone Close, and diverse parcels of land lying dispersedly in ye field called Stangerstone Field. That phrase, lying dispersedly, is probably a clear indication that the field contained numerous individual strip holdings of tenants of the lord of the manor, and the use of the term ye field called Stangerstone Field may be an indication that it was one of the fields, the town fields. Another much later document from 1882 actually refers to a parcel of land lying and being in a common field called Stannerstones. We find what may be an earlier form of the name, Standanderstein, in Lowther documents dating from 1216, probably derived from the Middle English standander, standing, and the Old English stan, pronounced stan, meaning rock or stone. Now, these would not be standing stones like Long Meg or Gamelands, taking some local examples, and certainly not like Stonehenge. They could have been naturally occurring Shap granite erratics, or boulders moved into position to be used as boundary stones, or mere stones as they were called, between the strips of land in town fields. So the stones which gave Stannerstones its name might have looked more like this. I believe this to be a surviving mere or boundary stone, still in the position it may have occupied for 800 years or more. It's not in Stannerstones, it's in one of Brian Smith's fields in Little Asby, a field still called Town Field. So that would once have been the town field of Little Asby Manor. It's close to the track now known as Puddle Lane that would once have been the route down to Little Asby corn mill at Waterhouses. We can trace its position close to that track on this extract from the Asby Parish tithe map surveyed in 1840. The stone lies at the end of what is a dotted line on that map. I've enhanced that line here with the red dashes. That dotted line indicated what was the boundary between two separate strips of land, which still had no fence or wall marking that boundary in the middle of the 19th century. But the position of the boundary was indicated by that large stone. Now to a second probable town field of Asby Winderwath Manor, Trowlands. To help you get your bearings, I've marked Bow Bridge, which you pass when driving northeastish out of Great Asby towards Appleby. You can see the white streak of Rob Braithwaite's silage plastic in the Bow Bridge yard. I've also marked the house and buildings called Trowlands. Here is a similar entry in the Manor Court Book to the one we looked at for Stannerstones, and as you can see, it was made on that same January day in 1735. This entry also implies that a number of different parcels of land are to be found here at Trowlands. And again that reference to a field called, which also implies this was one of the fields, the common fields, the town fields. But we can also find the name written as Trowans, Trowans and Trowan. And I've identified here on the screen some possibilities for words this name may be derived from. You can see them by each of the three red arrows. As a dialect word, throw, probably pronounced trow, and sometimes also written without the H, meaning to dispute or contradict. As another dialect word, trow, meaning troll. And a regional dialect word, trouts, also written trance, meaning a long, weary walk. Here we have an extract from the first edition of the 6-inch Ordnance Survey map. There's Bow Bridge towards the top centre. I've marked by an arrow that one section of these Trowlands fields, which was identified as a detached part of Asby Coatsford Township. That's the manor or township on the other side of the Asby Beck. This might be seen as evidence there had once been some kind of historic dispute about where these lands belonged, and it could be seen as the clincher that their name derives from the word marked by the first of the red arrows towards the foot of this slide, that dialect word meaning to dispute or contradict. But there's a bit of me which likes to think that there's a more playful naming going on here, and that the name really derives from the third option, trounce or trance, a long, weary walk. The mile or more walk back to the medieval farmsteads in the village of Great Asby may indeed have been a long, weary walk, especially so at the end of a hard day struggling to manoeuvre a heavy ox plough. Sections or furlongs of the town fields also had names. I've listed some parish examples here, including one at the foot of the screen, which may be an echo of an ancient special rental arrangement. I'll take the second one, Falkland, first. There are a number of examples of this name to be found in Cumbria and in Scotland. As you can see, it's probably derived from a word that was probably pronounced something like fork. It's a dialect word of uncertain date and origin for fallow, although it may have its root in older words that had to do with ploughing or the breaking up of land. It came to be a word applied to one part of the townfield system, an outfield area that was left fallow and used for crops only at intervals. Therefore, I think you'd expect to find it at the edge of more intensively and regularly farmed townfield areas, and that's exactly where we find this field in the manor of Little Asby. Let's look next at the Coulter lands. Here they are, just south of the village of Great Asby and to the east of the infant Asby Beck as it makes its way through Asby Gill. You can read here that the name Coulterlands, meaning the ploughing lands, derives from Old English coulter, the vertical cutting blade, fixed in front of the share of a plough. The earliest reference we have is from when George Smith gifted land to fund the establishment of Asby Endowed School in 1688. One of the parcels of land was described as being in a place called Coulterlands in Asby Cotsworth Field. By the time of the tithe map in the 1840s, some 150 years or so later, this parcel of land, along with all the others gifted to establish the school, had, unsurprisingly perhaps, acquired the name School Land. One of the other names we're looking at, Flat, is derived from Old Norse flot, meaning a level area of ground, adapted into Middle English as flat. Dilly, who's made a study of agricultural terms used in the region, points out that the word came to mean a division of a large, open, arable field, or a furlong, the kind of units we're talking about here. Here, on this LiDAR image, are our Coulterlands and flats. Those of you who watched the Westmoreland Dales webinar I did in 2021 will have seen this slide before. Lots of rig and furrow in this landscape, lots of evidence of cultivation, of ploughing across many centuries. Finally, in this section, that echo of an old rental agreement. Get your bearings first. We're south of the farmsteads of Clockeld and Stenkeld, away beyond the west end of Great Asby. There's the beginning of Asby Gill in the top right corner of the image. There are a number of late 12th and 13th century documents that refer to land in the Asby manors being granted in return for rent and service. Service which included items such as a service of pepper or cumin at the Fair of St. Lawrence, that would have been held in Appleby on August the 10th each year, or a pound of pepper. Therefore, I think it seems very likely that the Pepperlands preserve in their name a memory of rent and service which was given for them some 800 years ago. A very common source of names we find in the landscape are the topography and the nature of the surface of the land or the soil. I'm not going to look in detail at all of these. Let's leave the first name Berwins for the moment. We'll come back to it. Hardings sounds a bit negative, but hard may simply refer to a firm or dry meadow, with the second element from the Old Norse ing, meaning meadow. Hungry Haber. Haber is another Old Norse word for meadowland. Literally, it means hay hill. The hungry element may mean it's ground that needed a lot of muck. Kitty Slosh. Pretty obvious, this one. You can almost feel the water in your boots. The kitty element probably from a diminutive of the forename Christopher. Slacks, a hollow, a place in a valley. Sour Hill, acidic ground. Staingarth, we've already met Stain, so the Staingarth would be a stony field, a stony enclosure, the second element from the Old Norse Gartha, an enclosure. Back now to Berwins. This is just one of the places where we could find the name in the parish. Again, first get your bearings. Scalebeck at the top there, the Drybeck Road cutting through the top right corner of the image. If you've ever walked the footpath from Dial Barn, that's on the far side of the church here in Great Asby, to Scalebeck, you'll have walked alongside these fields. I mentioned that we could have gone to a number of places in the parish to find this name. For example, in Little Asby we have Berwains and Burnwains as well as Berwins. But no matter how it is spelled, it is derived from Old English begazen, burial place, or Middle English beganus, cairn, or heap of stones. The word could be applied to clearance cairns and boundary markers, as well as having a narrower application to burial cairns. But it was also sometimes used of surface scatters of stone at archaeological sites. Boroness in Crosby Ravensworth contains the remains of an ancient village, and Berwins in Kirby Thor is the site of the Roman fort there, Bravoniacum. The Barwins we see here, according to Ronnie Walker, formerly of Elm Tree, who used to farm them, are stony only at the bottom end. This observation, along with the likelihood that they would once have been just outside the outring fence, the boundary wall or bank around the townfields of Asby Windowatt that we mentioned earlier, leads me to wonder if they might have taken their name from the association with a stone structure marking that boundary. But in the parish we have our own example of the root of the name Berwins being used to describe surface stone at an archaeological site, as it is in Crosby Ravensworth and Kirby Thor. Here it is, where it is the source of one element in the name Holborn Hill, top right of the image. As before, first orientate yourself. There's the now very ruined farmstead of Linglow on the right, the now rather sadly dilapidated barn called Bertagill towards the bottom of the screen, and the still very much intact farmstead of Stenkeld. Asbygill runs between the last two, diagonally up towards the top left of the image. This will be an area very familiar to those of you who do the short Priest Path Bertagill Asbygill walk. The name Holborn Hill is actually another example of what we looked at on slide 7 when I mentioned Linglow Hill, a different Linglow, by the way, to the one on this slide. You can see from the text below the slide number, where a 1216 record of the name is given, that we already have a part of the Holborn Hill name which means hill. That's the hol element, derived from the Old Norse hoka, in a similar way to the low in Linglow. But when hol ceased to be familiar to people, the more modern word hill was added. So, with those three elements of the name, the hol, the bourne, and the added hill, what we've really got now is the hill, Stony Hill. While we're at Holborn Hill, we shouldn't overlook nearby Pate Hole, not very many yards down the slope from this probable late Iron Age Roman period site. I've approximated the distance on this extract from the first edition of the 6-inch Ordnance Survey map. Most of the time, the entrance to Pate Hole looks like this. Many of you will have walked past it many times. But sometimes, after heavy rain, it looks like this, with water surging from the mouth of the cave. Some years ago, in 1802, a contributor to the monthly magazine described this surging. It has been known to discharge itself into the air to the height of 6 feet above the opening. At the flux and reflux of the water, a great noise is heard to the distance of several miles, and which sometimes resembles the loudest thunder. At other times it is like different musical instruments. In the Iron Age, many places where there was a connection with the underworld like this, liminal places, often watery places, would have been sacred places. The noises here described in 1802 would almost certainly, 2,000 years earlier, when Holborn Hill was in use, have made Pate Hole a very special place. These noises would have been seen as instruments of the earth, as voices of the earth. Pate Hole would then have probably had a name in an ancient Brittonic language, a name that would have defined this source of water occasionally and mysteriously flowing from beneath the ground, as a sacred place. Now it is just plain old Pate Hole, a name for a badger hole, or more generally an animal's lair. As with the nature of the land and the soil, unsurprisingly, different kinds of livestock also give their names to fields and to landscape features. Most of them are fairly straightforward. Hencroft, third on this list, is depicted on this rather nice 1768 estate map of Asby Grange. There it is, away to the left, highlighted in yellow, and, as you would expect of an enclosure for hens, close to the building of Asby Grange itself. My particular thanks to Dr. David Johnson for this image. There are a number of field names that contain the element ox or oxen. Oxen, of course, were the tractors of medieval England. Some of these names may refer to enclosures where they were kept when they were being worked often, others perhaps when they were on more open grazing at quieter times in early summer. Other names here feature commonly found livestock, cows, horses and pigs. Bull copy may be a little more puzzling. There was more than one field of this name in Asby Parish by the 19th century. Most, the one at Gaythorne Hall was an exception, were small enclosures where, predictably enough, a bull was kept. The suggestion is that the second element of the name, copy, refers to coppice. This seems a little odd, unless it is a loose application of the word coppice to what we would now describe as wood pasture. In a paper published in 2013, one landscape historian speculated that a possible alternative meaning for copy might lie in its derivation from copulo to couple, the same source as for the vernacular to cop off, to have sex. The bull copy, the author of the 2013 piece suggests, was simply the place where the bull copped off. Now, whether this speculation will stand up, if you'll forgive the very unfortunate intrusion of that phrase, whether this speculation will stand up to scholarly scrutiny is quite another matter. Now, to a name in the parish landscape that doesn't sound as if it had an association with livestock, but probably did. As usual, get your bearings as to where we are now. We're looking at a group of fields that lie between Upper Wygill Head and Fell Head, at the far left on the screen. There's the road running from the crossroads near Wygill Head down to Little Asby. The meaning of far seems at first glance straightforward enough, but at the very end of the 19th century a question was raised. The Reverend Canon Thornley, writing in 1899 in the Transactions of the Cumberland and Westmoreland Antiquarian and Archaeological Society about the field names of Kirkoswald, made this observation: the striking absence of allusion to sheep in the field names of Kirkoswald raises a suspicion that some of the far lands, so often mentioned as field names he means, may be grazing grounds of the far, a Norse word for sheep. Some of these far lands are by no means far from the homestead, and they are, Thornley continues, without the companion near field. Thornley's last point about the absence of a near field could also be made about Asby's far fields. Here too, as Thornley puts it, the far fields are without the companion near field. Only, and rather oddly it could be argued, a near far field, it's there, top left, which may suggest that the second element in that name had little to do with distance. Thornley's speculation that the name of Farfield may indicate an association with sheep should be looked at alongside some documentary evidence. It's a late 12th or early 13th century grant of Asby land made to the Cistercian Abbey of Byland in North Yorkshire for a specific purpose. This extract on the screen here is from a translation of the charter that granted that land, which historian Janet Burton drew attention to in a book published in 2004. Unfortunately, as Janet points out, the name of the donor is missing from the original folio in the Byland records. The charter refers, as you can see here, to land given to Byland to fence and enclose as the monks please. It goes on, this grant is made for the salvation of the soul of the donor and of all his or her, as it might be the case, ancestors and heirs. Permission to make a sheepfold above Stannerstones for 300 sheep by the long 100. A long 100, as you can read here within the square brackets at the end, actually numbered 120. Note that location above Stannerstones, the highlighted name. And here, just by the road to Little Asby, are two fields, Stannerstones and Stannerstones Mire. The boundary of the far fields is indeed above Stannerstones, as the words of the charter describe the location of the sheepfold. Let's go back for a moment to those charter words. All the evidence here implies that the word translated as sheepfold refers to a whole sheep farming operation, not to a fold as we would normally think of it. I haven't seen the original charter, but the Latin word used was probably bercaria, which meant sheep farm, and such a larger operation is, I believe, obviously implied by those opening words, referring to lands which the monks are to fence and enclose as they please. In contrast now, a field name, Euthrops, that sounds as if it would have had something to do with livestock, with sheep, but probably didn't. As ever, let's be clear where we are. We're between the farmsteads of Clockeld and Stenkeld and the Townhead area of Great Asby village. Townhead is just out of shot at the top centre of the image. Here you can see that it's a name which has undergone quite a few changes over the years. Some names sound rather like the present name, Euthrops, others less so, such as the rather suburban sounding Enthorpe of the 1840s. But if we look a little further back in time and go to the final paragraph, to an early 14th century document from a period when the Hospital of St. Peter, or later called St. Leonard at York, appears to be vacating its lands in Asby, we find references to land the hospital had held at a place called Steinekeldslack, mentioned together with 6 acres on Overthorpe, which I think strongly implies that the two places might be very close to each other. Between the time of that 14th century document and the tithe map of the 1840s, I think Steinekeldslack has become Low Stenkeld. Remember the word slack on an earlier slide, meaning a hollow or a low-lying place. As you can see here on the slide, Steinekeldslack is right next door to Euthrops. So I think that our Euthrops was once Overthorpe. Thorpe, as you can read here, is a word for an outlying secondary settlement, an outlying farmstead or a small hamlet dependent on a larger place. Its relationship to that larger place often indicated by direction or position. So you might have Upper or Lower Thorpe, or an East or West or Thorpe. In our case, Upper is expressed with the word over. So a translation of Overthorpe, an upper secondary settlement, gives us something very close to the meaning of the present day Townhead. And bearing in mind that the pronunciation of Overthorpe might have been something like Auerthorpe, it's not too difficult to see how Overthorpe became Euthrops. The field called Overthorpe may have been the communally farmed field of the tenants of Asby Winderwath Manor who lived at this hamlet we now know as Townhead. And if you look closely at that field called Overthorpe, or also known as we now know as Euthrops, it certainly has evidence of earlier ploughing. One other intriguing point, and we're on to the last paragraph now, is that Thorpe is predominantly a Danish word. This may imply that Viking settlers were arriving here from the east in the 10th century, from the collapsing Danish kingdom at York, as well as from Ireland and the Western Isles. So this would have introduced yet another cultural strand into the language of landscape in Asby Parish. We've already seen that some fairly obvious characteristics of the landscape gave rise to minor place names. Shape is another of those characteristics. Sadly, the graphically named Broad Arstaker is now lost to us. This name could be set alongside Parkin's Bottom in Sale Lane or Bernard's Backside in Little Asby. There is endless childish diversion in what we might call, or what some of us of a certain age might call, the Benny Hill school of the language of landscape. But there are some less comedic names to look at, and we must move on. I've chosen just two now lost names, lost in the sense that they had fallen out of use by the time of the tithe map, which may imply a link to shape. They are Harplands and Heater. My prime suspect for Harplands is a field across the road from Millrig. It's on the left side of the road, just as you leave Great Asby on the way to Bow Bridge. By the mid-19th century tithe map, it's called Kit's Close, no doubt taking its first element from the diminutive of Christopher, perhaps the name of a tenant holding the land at some point near the time when it was enclosed. But a field called Metcalfe's Harplands is closely associated with land at Millrig, very nearby, as you can see, in a number of manor court entries of the 18th and early 19th centuries. Here's the same field on the first edition of the 6-inch OS map, with my pictorial prompt alongside it. You don't think I'm stretching things too far to make this suggestion about a connection between the shape of a harp and the shape of a field, do you? You don't feel that I might be stringing you along. Take a few seconds to get your bearings. Our focus here is Cocklake How, or Heater, at the centre of this image of another section of the first edition of the 6-inch map. It's about 1 mile along Sale Lane. Probably first called Cocklake How, that's a hill, a how, which had a lecking ground or display ground for male black grouse or blackcock. It later came to be called Heater, probably, or almost certainly, because of its triangular shape. This was a name often given to three-sided fields because of their resemblance to the shape of a heater or flat iron stand. Now, some field boundaries shown on this first edition of the OS map have been removed over the years, so this heater shape, this three-sided shape, can no longer actually be seen on the ground. A change of emphasis here, a quick look at a few minor place names connected with some essential products found in or cultivated in the landscape of the manorial economy. Bertree Brackendolt, a name that was lost by the time of the tithe map. The first element gives its location in the parish, perhaps near or close by a track going to a place called Bertree. Now, whether that was Bertree Farm or whether it was Bertigill Barn, I'm not so sure. Bracken was the plant that was being sought. It would be cut in the autumn for use as livestock bedding, and in more recent times to provide insulation in earthen clamps used to store turnips in winter. Dolt comes from a word used for a dole or share of a designated bracken cutting area that would have been available to tenants of the manor. Hags, derived from yet another Old Norse word hog, relating to the felling of trees, but the word hag came to be used for one of the rotational sections of a coppiced wood. In Asby Parish, it is the name of a small group of fields close to the present-day Moor plantation, and is probably evidence that this area of the landscape was once part of carefully managed woodland of the manor of Asby Winderwath. Hemprig Bottom, another lost name, but it may have been the name of fields now simply called bottoms that lie between Dial Barn and Elm Tree Farmstead on the north side of the village, beyond the church. Hemp was an important crop, used to produce coarser products, not clothing, such as sacks and rope. The rig element in the name derives from the Middle English rig, or the Old Norse rigga, a cultivated strip of ground. Moss Syke. This was near Sunbing in Tarn, location of the turbery or peat cutting area for probably all the Asby manors. Another essential product, essential fuel. Moss is from the Old English moss or Old Norse mossi, a peat bog or swamp, and syke from Old English syke or syk, a small stream, especially one in flat marshland. And that is the kind of landscape we find close to the Tarn. Now, some mysteries, some curiosities. Elfermire, a now lost field name. Giltoe, more about how it should really be pronounced in a minute or two, is still with us as a field name. Turkey Tarn Hill, very much with us and still on modern OS maps. Lagram, another name now lost. Timpanygill, still with us. Widkenfell, lost. Potsbeck, a name still used, of course. And we'll look at them in the order I've listed them here. Elfermire is a name found in only one source. That 18th century estate map I mentioned at the beginning of Grange Hall that's in the possession of Andrew and Fiona Harrison of Grange Hall. Here it is on a photograph of a section of that map, and I'm grateful to Fiona for this image. A teardrop-shaped field at bottom centre. It's probably easier to get your bearings from this slide. There are the farmsteads of Grange Hall and Mizongill, with Elfermire reaching in the direction of Asbygill. As I said a few moments ago, this distinctive field name is no longer in use. The area itself is now subsumed within a larger field called Crooks, but it once had a clear, separate identity. There's a relict boundary wall running along the line I've shown in red on this slide. A view here of some very large glacial erratics to be found close to one end of Elfermire. There is no earlier spelling of the field name, but there may be a derivation from the Old Norse elfa or elf, which may be linked to these glacial erratics. Diane Whaley writes of grey rocks sometimes being associated with supernatural beings in other parts of the country, before concluding, rather disappointingly perhaps, but whether this might be the case in Cumbria is impossible to prove. Instead, perhaps we should look more closely at Elfermire's shape. Here it is again on that 18th century map. An archaeologist from the Yorkshire Dales National Park has suggested to me that its name could be derived from a Middle English word helfa, which means handle. The word is on the screen at top right, below the slide number and the field name. If you look down on this field from the land above it, you can see what could be imagined as its handle shape. Perhaps a knife handle. Imagine a blade running to the right from the narrow end. Now to Giltoe. There it is in yellow font towards the bottom left of the image. To help you get your bearings, I've marked Sale Lane, Townhead, top right, and the track, Cross Lonning, the narrow lane which runs more or less between the two. For some time I've been hoping to find the site of the village gallows where two Asby men, Edward Spooner and John Smith, may well have been hung for their part in the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1537. They were 2 of the 53 men from 20 Westmoreland parishes who were executed for their part in this uprising, seen by many as the most serious Tudor rebellion. The Tudor state terror machine arranged for many of the Westmoreland 53 to be hung in their own villages for maximum impact on the rest of the population. So, Spooner and Smith may well have been hanged in the village of Great Asby. It was my search for the place of their execution which drew me to the name Giltoe. Firstly, because it's most certainly not a gill in the sense that we normally understand that word, and then another apparent clue. It came from Canon Thornley, our old friend from the far fields, writing about Kirkoswald in that same journal paper in the Transactions of 1899. An extract from that paper, shown in the first paragraph here, refers to Gillgate, formerly Gallows Gate, the site of the Gallows Hill of the Kirkoswald Parish. When I encountered yet another clue in the English Dialect Dictionary, published in the same year, it's the second paragraph here, the tow or toe, albeit spelt a little differently, was Scots dialect for hangman's halter, my excitement knew no bounds. Then Jeff Taylor and old Arnie Morn told me the name was not pronounced Giltoe, it was Giltoe. My hard G of gallows was swept away in an instant. So I began searching for similar sounding names in other places. I eventually found one in Virginia Lascelles' book, Field Names of the Duddon Valley, one of the titles I mentioned near the beginning of this talk. There she has Gillet, a local name for a narrow lane. So we now have our field as a place that is at the end or at the toe of a narrow lane, a gillet. That narrow lane is our cross Lonning. Giltoe is almost certainly a simple contraction, a shortening of Gillet toe to Giltoe. So the search for the gallows continues. Now to the slightly silly sounding Turkey Tarn Hill, just out of the village of Great Asby, only a very short distance along the Mask Road. It's shown here on the first edition of the 6-inch OS map, but of course still called by this name on present-day maps. Turkey, in this context, seems meaningless. Surely there can't have been any association with the American woodland fowl. There is certainly a hill, 254 metres of it, beside the Mask Road, just across from Andrew Brown's place at Fieldhouse. There is no tarn, but there is a patch of civi or rushy ground in one corner. And here is that civi ground, viewed from the Mask Road, with a light scattering of Jeff Taylor's sheep on the higher ground behind it. As I did with Giltoe, or Giltoe as we now know it to be, I began to search around for similar sounding words to try to make sense of Turkey Tarn Hill. I came across a West Yorkshire minor place name, Turgate Lane, another name for a road or track which had been known in 1492 as the Turfway. And I began to wonder if the element Turkey in our Asby Parish name might have come about as a result of a mid-19th century OS surveyor, unfamiliar with local speech, mishearing the word Turgate, particularly when it was elided with tarn. Remember that contraction, that shortening that was part of how we arrived at Giltoe just a couple of slides back? Well, Turgate is another, a contraction of turf and the Old Norse word gata, a way or road. The Turgate or the Turgata would have been the turf road. What we now know as the Mask Road that passes close by Turkey Tarn Hill would almost certainly once have been an important route, if not the main route, by which turf was brought from the peat cutting grounds near Sunbig Tarn to farmsteads in the village of Great Asby. I suggest that what the Ordnance Survey surveyor should have heard was Turgot Tarn, not Turkey Tarn. But what of the tarn? Well, we've already looked at this area of rushy ground. When Jeff Taylor of Swathburn remembers that when he was a lad, 60 years or so ago, this area we're looking at was all water and ducks, what he's recalling is the now lost tarn, which once stood where there is only rushy ground today. But it was a body of water that reappeared briefly after Storm Desmond in 2015. So, if nothing else, I believe I've rescued Turkey Tarn Hill, with the help of Jeff Taylor, from meaningless absurdity and restored it to being a silent witness to perhaps close on 1,000 years of turf being carried from the Turbury at Sunbig Tarn to the hearths of Great Asby farmsteads. With the name Lagran, we've come back to a place we visited a couple of minutes ago. It's a much earlier name for a field now called Crooks, which also now embraces that unusually named field called Elfermire. Here we can see how the name Lagran changed across the years, from the time when we first find it as Leithgrim just after the middle of the 12th century. As you can read here, it's derived from the Old Norse word Leithgrimr, meaning track marker or indicator. And if we walk across this field, we find these. Large slabs of limestone deliberately placed on their edges, flanking a discernible holloway or track going down the slope away from us in this image. Could this be the track marker, the Leithgrimr? If the presence and position of these stones was sufficient to give this land its name by the mid-12th century, how much longer before that were they first put in place? Now to another name, Tympanygill, which may be even older and perhaps more curious. Let's get our bearings. The top centre of this image is the short section of the road going left up towards the cattle grid on Gaythorne Plain. And there is Coppermines Lane, branching away from that road, another location familiar to many of you from your walks. And there is our target, Tympanygill, running down from Asby Scar and across a number of fields that were enclosed from the open fell in the later part of the 19th century. In parts, it's quite a significant landscape feature, quite a deep gully. Here it is in Joyce Bousfield's field, where it's up to 5 yards, or just over 4.5 metres deep. What do we discover if we start looking for possible origins of its name? As you can see in the first paragraph here, place names of Cumberland gives us a similar place name, Timperon, with older spellings of Timpanorum and Tinpanorum. If Timpan be right, says the author, this is from Irish Tiompon, meaning small, abrupt hill. The website, placenamesni.org, actually gives Timpany as a place name. It's a townland in County Tyrone, Northern Ireland. This website goes on to say that the original meaning of Tiompon is timbrel or drum, but over time it developed a wide range of topographical meanings, including sometimes a standing stone. Could the name used in Asby apply to the stony features of the gill, which may be the remains of a collapsed cave system? But why might we have an Irish place name in Asby? Well, it has been argued that other Irish minor place names in this region are from incoming Hiberno-Norse settlers, who had some knowledge of Gaelic, perhaps from their time in Ireland or the Western Isles of Scotland, or simply due to the fact that they brought with them Gaelic-speaking wives. An extra twist here is that in 1993, on Joyce Bousfield's land, a detectorist found a Conquest metal hoard. I've marked the find spot with a star. That hoard is now in the British Museum. Included in the hoard was this gilt alloy plaque, believed to be Northumbrian work of the very early 9th century. The cross at its very centre may be a representation of the sacred host, and therefore it may have been attached to a box or satchel for carrying sacramental bread. The hoard also contained a number of livestock bells, the smaller of the two shown here on the top line, probably for goats, the other larger one, probably for cattle. The field where the hoard containing these bells was found also has evidence of a couple of settlements, perhaps late Iron Age or Roman period. Here's one substantial structure constructed using orthostats, that's big slabs of limestone placed on their edges. Is it too fanciful to think that these places may have been reused by Hiberno-Norse settlers as late as the 10th century? Not as permanent homes perhaps, but rather as temporary summer grazing accommodation. And is it too fanciful to think that these bells once sounded from the necks of Viking cattle and goats at their summer grazing on nearby Asby Common? Or too fanciful to believe that this copper alloy plaque, plundered from a Northumbrian monastery, might have been passed down through an Hiberno-Norse dynasty? We're staying with matters Viking as we go to our next name, Widken Fell. We're back close to Grange Hall. No surprise really, as archaeologically, historically, this is one of the busiest parts of our parish landscape. We first encounter the name Widken Fell in a 12th century charter that granted land here to Byland Abbey, that monastery in North Yorkshire that we encountered some slides back. The name probably applied to much of what was once open fell land that lay between what is now Grange Hall and what is now known as the Mask Road, out of shot at the top of this image. As you can see from the first paragraph on this slide, this name Widken is probably derived from the Old Norse personal name Vithkona. And there's another possible piece of Widken Fell's story that we can speculate about. To the south of Grange Hall, in a field now called Thorney, there is a potentially interesting longhouse site. It's marked here by a star. First identified by Nick Hyam of Manchester University in 1975, it has been suggested that this may be an early medieval site and possibly, just possibly, connected with early Norse settlers. Here, courtesy of Oxford Archaeology North, is more detail of the site, number 195 in their 2004 survey of Little Asby Common. The house structure is labelled 195.1 in this image. I've marked it by a red arrow. There are various enclosures around it and another building structure labelled as 195.5. The longhouse, 195.1, if you remember on the previous slide, is on a 13-metre long terrace cut into the slope of the field called Thorney. In this image, we're looking eastwards along that terrace. The red and white ranging pole, just left of centre, is placed on the west gable of the longhouse. There in the distance, just below the darker smudge of the Pennines, is Widken Fell, Vithkona's Fell. The fantasist in me would like to think that the longhouse that lies just in front of us, beyond that ranging pole, was once Vithkona's farmstead, or at least that of one of his brethren. But determining if that is the case will require a lot more work and investigation. Finally, to Potts Beck and Potts Valley. can I thank Andy Frisbee of Little Asby for this rather splendid image. It looks down from above Armourside to show the early meandering of the beck, which here marks the parish boundary. Crosby Garrett parish lands are on the other side of the beck. At centre right we see the tip of the northern end of the improved grassland of the Startling or Starling Hills, and on the slope beyond, up towards the horizon, an enclosure or sheepfold called Helm. At first glance, the name of the beck is a bit puzzling. The usual derivation of the name Potts that you find in textbooks and dictionaries is pretty much the one in the example I've given here. It's from Diane Whaley's fairly recent publication, A Dictionary of Lake District Place Names, where she suggests the name derives from a Middle English word potter or a similar dialect word, meaning a pit, hollow or pool in a riverbed. Possibly, she adds, the words may be of Scandinavian origin. But, unless I'm mistaken, I don't think Potts Beck has the deep pits or hollows of the kind we find in Asby Beck, in Asby Gill, the kettles as we now call them, or the cauldron leads as they are called in documents describing the riding of Asby Windawath manor boundaries in the 17th century. Could there be another explanation, I wonder, for the name of this rather gently flowing, apparently potless beck? Then something leapt out at me from a document dating from 1632, dating from June the 7th, 1632 to be precise. Basically, it's a set of rules drawn up by the inhabitants of Asby Windawath and Asby Coatsford to ensure that there was a fair and reasonable sharing out of that turf that was to be found close to Sunbegin Tarn. I've included here a couple of examples of the language used in the document, which sets out, as you can read, certain orders for the good and lawful, and there are some words missing here, of Kellett and Sunbegin Moor, for the graving of peats, turves and pulling of ling. And the second one, that no man or other on this side of the said beck grave, that's dig, any toppings, now that was the backfill of the turf cuttings, or leave any of these pots unbedded, that means not properly backfilling the holes so as to prevent them being a danger to livestock that were grazing on the open fell. But what I really want to point out here is that word pots. It's used a number of times in this 17th century document, and it's a word which refers, I have said, to the peat cuttings. Is it significant that our Potts Beck has its source in the swampy ground east of Sunbegin Tarn, between the Tarn and Mesanwath, close to the Tarn Moss, where those peat cuttings, those pots, were to be found? I believe it is significant, and I believe that Potts Beck has its name because it does rise close to those pots, places where the people of Asby Parish dug their fuel for centuries before it moves in sinuous fashion down the first stretch of its rather beautiful valley. With Potts Valley, this little jewel of the landscape of Asby Parish, I end, and leave you, rather oddly or even pretentiously you may think, with the closing words of Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. So we beat on, boots against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. Not given in the spirit of futility and hopelessness, which Fitzgerald probably intended to convey at the end of the novel, but instead they are words given in the hope that what I have been talking about may enable you, as you walk across the palimpsest of the landscape of Asby Parish, to be yourselves borne back, ceaselessly even, into the past. Goodbye, and thank you for listening.